August 1940. They called it a joke, a flying bathtub, a whale with wings. When the first photographs of the PBY Catalina reached German intelligence, engineers in Berlin reportedly laughed. A plane that could land on water, move slower than most fighters could stall, and carry more fuel than bombs. Too heavy to fight, one Luftwaffe officer sneered, too fragile to survive. Even among Allied pilots, skepticism spread like a quiet rumor. Who would volunteer to fly a machine that couldn't outclimb, outshoot, or outrun anything? To most, the Catalina was a relic before it even proved itself. Its large rounded hull looked absurd compared to the sleek metallic lines of the Spitfires and Messerschmitts that filled the skies. When parked beside them, the flying boat seemed ancient, like something from an era when flight itself was still a miracle. It wasn't designed to dance with enemy fighters or to impress generals at air shows. It was designed for endurance, and endurance was never glamorous. But as the war stretched across oceans, the world began to realize something that no one had seen coming. Glamour doesn't win wars. Persistence does. In the vast, merciless emptiness of the Atlantic and the Pacific, where a single mistake meant vanishing forever, speed was useless without sight. Fighters ruled the skies, but the oceans belonged to whoever could see farther, stay longer, and strike where no one expected. That's when the flying bathtub started to matter. Catalina crews flew for 16, sometimes 18 hours, their engines humming over waves that stretched beyond imagination. They didn't chase glory, they hunted shadows. Submarines that could cripple entire fleets, freighters that vanished without warning, survivors adrift in silence. All waited beneath them. What others called slow, the sea called patient. The first missions were routine, endless hours of nothing but horizon. Pilots learned to recognize the color of the ocean, the shape of a cloud, the way light reflected off periscopes miles below. The Catalina's strength was not in firepower, but in presence, the ability to be everywhere, to cover every forgotten corner of the map. Its pilots became the eyes of the Allied fleets, their radios whispering warnings before the enemy even knew they'd been found. Then one day, the laughter stopped. Somewhere over the cold gray waters north of Ireland, a Catalina spotted the faint shimmer of oil, a trace too small for most to notice. The crew turned, descended, and followed the stain like blood on water. Minutes later, a German U-boat broke the surface. Startled, its deck crew scrambling for the anti-air gun. The Catalina dropped low, its engines roaring, and released a pattern of depth charges that landed with surgical precision. The ocean erupted, a geyser of foam and metal. When it cleared, only debris remained. That night, in a dimly lit briefing room, the message arrived. U-boat confirmed, destroyed by PBY patrol. The officers reading the report didn't laugh. They didn't speak. For the first time, the ungainly flying boat had proven what few believed possible, that in a war of machines, the one mocked most could become the deadliest of all. And somewhere, above a quiet Atlantic, a Catalina crew flew home under the fading sun. Tired, soaked in salt, but carrying the quiet satisfaction of those who know they've changed everything. The ocean never cared for rules or runways. Waves rose and fell like breathing steel, swallowing ships and dreams alike. Most aircraft feared that horizon. For them, water was the end. But for the Catalina, it was home. What others saw as a weakness became its greatest advantage. It could land anywhere the sea allowed, refuel from a passing ship, take off again, and vanish into the mist as if it had never existed. This single trait changed everything. The Catalina turned the ocean from an obstacle into a base. It didn't need concrete or airstrips. Its pilots could chase submarines, rescue survivors, or deliver supplies to places maps barely remembered. While bombers returned to their hangars and fighters circled the same airfields, the Catalina drifted freely, a ghost of the waves. Crews learned to dance with the sea. They studied wind direction, watched for swells, and picked landing zones where even a small mistake could rip the hull apart. At night, they could touch down in complete darkness, guided only by moonlight and instinct. What had once been a gimmick became a ritual, an act of trust between man, machine, and water. It wasn't long before this strange talent began saving lives. A convoy under attack would call for help, and hours later, Through fog and gunfire, a Catalina would appear, gliding down beside sinking ships, pulling the wounded from the waves and taking off again under enemy fire. Sometimes it rescued only one man, sometimes an entire crew. But every time it returned, soaked and scarred, it carried proof that no one was truly lost as long as the Catalinas still flew. Even the enemy began to notice. U-boats once thought they could hide under cloud cover or slip through storm fronts. Then came reports of a plane that lands on the sea, attacking from nowhere, refueling beside destroyers, and vanishing before anyone could react. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. The Catalina was everywhere, a silent witness to every secret the ocean tried to keep. The same pilots who once mocked its clumsy frame now swore by it. They said the Catalina wasn't just an aircraft. It was a companion. It didn't soar like a hawk. It stalked like a patient predator. And in a war where survival depended on adaptability, nothing was more powerful than a machine that made the impossible, landing on the endless sea, look effortless. Endless blue stretched in every direction, sky above, ocean below, and nothing in between. For the men inside the Catalina, that emptiness became their entire world. The hum of twin engines was the only sound for hours, a lullaby and a warning all at once. They flew low and slow, the horizon trembling in the heat, eyes burning as they scanned for anything out of place. An oil slick, a shadow, a wake, 18 hours of staring into infinity, knowing that somewhere beneath those waves, unseen metal monsters waited. The early Atlantic patrols were tests of endurance as much as courage. Fatigue was constant, conversation rare. Every man in the crew had his own silent routine. The navigator tracing invisible lines across maps, the radio operator listening to static that never changed, the pilot adjusting levers by instinct. There was no glamour, no glory, only duty and the vast, indifferent sea. The danger was invisible, but ever present. Sometimes the weather itself became the enemy, sudden storms that tossed the Catalina like driftwood, lightning that illuminated the surface just long enough to show white-capped waves, then darkness again. Inside the hull, men tightened their seatbelts and said nothing. The aircraft creaked and groaned, but it kept flying, stubborn as the men who guided it. Hours passed, and the line between ocean and sky began to blur. Fatigue made every ripple look like a periscope, every shadow like a submarine silhouette. False alarms came often, real ones rarely. But when they came, when that faint glimmer appeared just where it shouldn't, everything changed in an instant. One patrol had almost given up for the day when the observer called out, his voice sharp with disbelief. A thin trail of bubbles, stretching diagonally across the calm sea. The pilot banked left, eyes narrowing, and there it was. The unmistakable gray spine of a surfaced U-boat gliding just beneath the surface. For a heartbeat, both sides were unaware of each other, then movement. Men on the deck, scrambling, pointing, shouting. The Catalina dove, its engines howling as the crew armed the depth charges. No time to think, just instinct and training. The bomber passed low over the waves, the ocean rising up to meet it. Then a jolt, a release, and the world exploded in foam and thunder. The aircraft shuddered from the blast, rising back into the clouds as seawater slammed against its hull. Below, the U-boat rolled sideways, breaking apart in the boiling sea. When the noise faded, there was only silence. The Catalina circled once more, the crew staring down at the widening oil slick. Hours of emptiness had led to seconds of chaos, and now, proof that their patience meant victory. They radioed the position, marked the spot, and turned for home. The men said little on the way back. They didn't need to. Somewhere deep inside, between exhaustion and relief, each one knew the truth. This is what the Catalina was built for, to wait, to watch, to strike once, and disappear into the endless blue. Night over the Atlantic was a living thing, vast, breathing, and filled with hidden predators. The Catalina crews called it the Black Ocean above the Black Ocean. Out there, the horizon vanished, the stars blurred, and the only light came from the pale glow of instruments and the occasional flicker of lightning far away. Somewhere below, German U-boats prowled like sharks, invisible and patient. To hunt them, the men of the Catalina had to become just as silent, just as ruthless. They learned to trust their senses more than their instruments. The early radars were crude, green screens flickering with static, the faintest blip, often just a wave or cloud reflection. Yet the trained eye could tell the difference. The operator's hand would freeze over the display, voice low but urgent. "Contact, bearing 085. Then the crew would come alive. The engines throttled down to a whisper, the plane gliding like a ghost across the waves. Spotlights and flares became their weapons as much as bombs and depth charges. A single magnesium flare could turn the night into day for a few seconds, just long enough to reveal a silhouette cutting through the water or men scrambling on a submarine deck. Those seconds were everything. The bombardier's finger tightened on the release switch, and the Catalina plunged from the clouds, roaring like a beast awakened. The Germans, too, learned quickly. They began traveling submerged during daylight, surfacing only at night to breathe and recharge. But night was now Catalina's kingdom. Painted black from nose to tail, engines muffled, the aircraft could approach undetected, using moonlight to silhouette the U-boat against the silver surface. The duel became one of nerves. Who would see first? Who would strike faster? There were no easy victories. A U-boat's deck gun could tear a Catalina apart if it came too close. The crews knew this. They flew low anyway, trusting the darkness and their luck. Sometimes the hunter became the hunted. A flash from below, a burst of tracer fire, a shock wave rocking the hull. The pilot would pull up hard, salt spray blinding the windshield, men shouting through the intercom. Every mission carried that risk. One mistake, and the ocean would erase them completely. Yet the Catalina's strength was not aggression, but persistence. It could stay in the air long after the submarine's batteries died. The crews learned to circle their prey for hours, waiting for the moment the U-boat was forced to surface again. When it did, exhausted and half blind, the flying boat would already be there, engines silent, drifting above the waves like a predator that never sleeps. The ocean became a chessboard of shadows and echoes. Each side played with patience, deception, and fear. But slowly, the balance began to shift. The more the Catalinas hunted, the fewer U-boats returned. The laughter that once greeted the idea of a flying boat had long since vanished. In its place came whispers among the submariners, stories of black-winged phantoms that appeared out of nowhere, glowing briefly in the night before unleashing fire from the sky. For the men of the Catalina, it wasn't heroism that drove them, but the quiet satisfaction of mastery, knowing that in the darkest, loneliest corners of the war, they had become the unseen hunters of the unseen enemy. The night was thick with mist, the kind that blurred the horizon until sky and sea became one endless void. The Catalina moved through it like a ghost, engines throttled low, lights off, wings glistening with condensation. Inside the cockpit, the crew whispered more than spoke. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and tension. They had been flying for 14 hours, hunting a contact reported by a destroyer earlier that evening. Nothing yet, only waves, wind, and static. Then the radar operator froze. A faint echo, weak but steady, pulsed on the green screen. "Bearing 150, he whispered. The pilot's hands tightened on the controls. They turned silently toward the signal. No one moved. Outside, the world was black. The Catalina dropped lower, skimming just above the swells, its wake barely a ripple in the moonlight. The ocean below seemed empty, until it wasn't. Out of the fog emerged a dark shape, long and narrow, cutting across the waves like a blade. The crew's hearts raced. A U-boat surfaced to breathe. Men on deck, unaware. The pilot nodded once. They would attack. The bombardier armed the depth charges, the gunner swung his turret, and the co-pilot adjusted the trim. The Catalina came around, circling wide to approach from behind. Every second stretched. The U-boat crew still hadn't seen them, until the flare dropped. It burst overhead with a violent hiss, turning the night into blinding daylight. The submarine lay fully exposed, its wet steel glistening white under the glare. German sailors shouted, scrambling to man the anti-air gun. Too late. The Catalina roared into the dive, wings trembling, engines screaming as it descended straight toward the glowing target. Tracers ripped through the air, red lines slicing the darkness. One tore across the wing, another shattered a window, showering the navigator with glass. but the pilot held course. Now! The bombardier released the pattern. 4 depth charges tumbled down, their silver casings glinting as they fell. The Catalina pulled up hard, its engines howling as explosions erupted below. The sea convulsed, geysers of white foam and black smoke rising like pillars. The shockwave hit the aircraft like a giant's fist, rattling every rivet in its frame. The crew shouted, braced, and then silence. They circled back through the smoke. Where the U-boat had been, there was only a widening patch of oil and debris, a single orange lifebuoy spinning slowly in the waves. The gunner exhaled for the first time in minutes. The pilot said nothing, just kept the plane level, his hands trembling on the yoke. They flew on in silence, the flare's afterglow still haunting their eyes. The laughter that once followed them, the jokes about the flying bathtub, the duck that couldn't fight, all seemed like a memory from another life. Tonight the Catalina had spoken for itself. It had hunted, struck, and survived. As dawn broke over the horizon, light touched the sea like forgiveness. The men sat quietly, exhaustion sinking in. The pilot finally murmured, almost to himself, "She's not slow anymore." And somewhere beneath the calm Atlantic surface, the ocean whispered its reply, the only witness left to the night the U-boat cried. By the time the war reached the Pacific, the Catalina was no longer a curiosity. It was a legend in motion. The vast blue expanses of that ocean made even the Atlantic seem small. Here, islands were scattered like grains of sand, and fleets vanished into the horizon as easily as a single ship in a storm. No airfield could cover such distances. No destroyer could patrol them all. The only machine that could bridge this boundless sea was the one that needed no runway, the same flying boat once laughed at in hangars across Europe. Over the Pacific, the Catalina became more than a patrol aircraft. It became the eyes and ears of the entire Allied fleet. Its silhouette, long wings, slow heartbeat of engines, was the first sign of hope to stranded sailors and the last shadow of warning to the enemy. From the Aleutians to the Solomons, from Midway to the Philippines, the Catalinas flew endless arcs over water, so empty it could drive a man mad. They charted enemy movements, spotted hidden convoys, and tracked ships weaving through coral labyrinths that no radar could map. Day after day, they guided bomber squadrons toward their targets. When storms swallowed formations whole, the Catalinas found them again, circling patiently until lost aircraft could follow their signal home. They scouted ahead for invasion fleets, mapping reefs and lagoons where entire armies would soon land. Their reports, often written in shaking hands after 18-hour flights, changed the course of naval battles fought hundreds of miles away. To the Japanese Navy, they were an irritant at first, an odd, slow-moving scout that could be ignored. But that illusion didn't last. One by one, their convoys were intercepted, their ambushes spoiled, their supply lines exposed. Somewhere out in the vastness, unseen and untouchable, the Catalinas were watching. They appeared in the most impossible places, above lonely atolls, in the path of night convoys, beside sinking ships, always a step ahead. The Japanese began to give them a name, whispered with irritation and respect. Yokante, the night ghost. They learned to fear that sound, the deep, steady drone of engines overhead, because it meant their secrets were no longer theirs. Their ships would scatter, their lights extinguish, their radios fall silent, but the ghost would still be there, unseen in the darkness. Meanwhile, to Allied sailors, that same sound meant life. Downed pilots stranded on rafts would hear it first as a faint vibration, then as salvation. A Catalina gliding down through rain and smoke, touching the waves with the grace of an angel. The crew would haul the survivors aboard, soaked and half-conscious, then rise again into the sky before enemy patrols could arrive. Each mission was a gamble, the ocean unpredictable, the enemy relentless, but the Catalinas kept flying. Even their supposed weakness became strength. Their slow speed allowed them to loiter where faster planes could not, to comb the sea inch by inch until every ripple had been searched. Pilots learned to trust the stillness, to feel the rhythm of the waves, to know when something beneath them wasn't right. In the Pacific, patience became a weapon, and the Catalina was its master. For those who once mocked its clumsy body, there was a cruel irony. The ugly duckling had grown into a predator that ruled the ocean skies, not through speed or power, but through endurance and quiet intelligence. Its very simplicity made it indestructible in spirit. And as the sun sank over the Pacific, painting the water gold, another Catalina rose from the waves, heavy with fuel, light with faith, heading toward the horizon where new battles waited, and where the ghost of the sea would never sleep. At night, the Pacific turned into another world, a vast expanse of ink and silence. The moonlight shimmered on calm lagoons, palm trees cast motionless shadows, and somewhere beyond the coral reefs, war slept uneasily. It was in these hours, when the world seemed to hold its breath, that the black Catalinas took to the sky. Painted in matte midnight tones from nose to tail, they were nearly invisible against the stars. Even their engines, muffled and tuned for stealth, blended with the ocean's low whisper. The crews called them Black Cats, and to the Japanese stationed on remote islands, they were phantoms, the ghosts of the night. These missions were unlike any others. No formation flying, no radio chatter, no navigation lights. The Catalina crews relied on moonlight, instinct, and their memory of maps burned into their minds. They slipped between atolls and volcanic peaks, flying so low they could see the reflection of their wings ripple on the surface below. Every sound mattered, a shift in the wind, a change in engine tone, the faint echo of distant waves against cliffs. To be heard was to die. They came not to fight head-on, but to haunt. Some nights they dropped mines into narrow harbors, trapping enemy ships by morning. Other nights they shadowed convoys, reporting positions so precise that by dawn, Allied bombers would already be waiting. They carried no glory, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the enemy never saw them coming. Sometimes their orders were stranger still. A lone Catalina would glide over a darkened island, its crew staring down at the dim glow of campfires below, enemy soldiers unaware that death circled just above them. The bombardier would pull the lever, and a string of small bombs would fall silently, each one blooming into a flash that tore the stillness apart. By the time the echoes faded, the Catalina was gone, swallowed again by the black sky. Those who survived such attacks spoke of it with awe and fear. They said the sound came first, a low hum that rose from nowhere, like the beating of distant wings, then the explosions, and then silence. No one ever saw the aircraft itself. To the island garrisons, the Black Cats became myth, creatures that prowled the night sky, untouchable and relentless. Inside the aircraft, the reality was far from mythic. The men flew for endless hours, drenched in sweat, their eyes aching from the strain of night vision. They operated in total darkness, guided only by faint compass lights and the glow of the stars. They ate cold rations, whispered their coordinates, and waited for dawn that always came too slowly. Yet there was a strange beauty in it, the sense of being the only living thing between the sea and the heavens. When the mission ended, they would find an empty stretch of ocean and descend silently, the black hull touching the water with a soft hiss. Engines idled down. The plane floated there in perfect stillness, rocking gently with the waves. The men leaned out of the hatches, breathing salt air, watching the first light creep over the horizon. Behind them, the island they had struck still burned faintly, a smear of orange against the dark. Then, as if the night itself had created them, they would start the engines again, rise into the thinning mist, and disappear toward home. No witnesses, no proof, only rumors whispered in enemy outposts of a flying shadow that came from nowhere and vanished before dawn. To those who saw them, it was witchcraft. To those who flew them, it was precision. And to the ocean below, it was just another ripple in the eternal rhythm of war. The ghost of the islands passing quietly overhead, unseen, unstoppable, unforgettable. The Pacific could turn cruel in an instant. One moment a pilot soared above the clouds, the next he was floating alone in a vast blue desert, clinging to a life raft that drifted endlessly between horizon and sky. The sun burned, the waves hissed, and the silence pressed in, broken only by the distant hum of engines that might never come. But then, faintly at first, that hum grew louder. It wasn't a fighter or a bomber. It was deeper, steadier, almost like the heartbeat of the ocean itself. And for countless stranded men, that sound meant salvation. The Catalinas were coming. They called them angels of the sea. The name fit not because of their appearance, but because of what they represented. Hope in a place where hope shouldn't exist. Painted white or gray, their wings stretched wide over the endless water, scanning for the smallest flicker of orange fabric, a life vest, a flare, a waving hand. Sometimes they found only wreckage. Sometimes, miraculously, they found life. The rescues were never easy. To land on calm seas was difficult enough. To do it in rough surf, under fire, or in storm conditions was almost impossible. Yet the Catalina crews did it again and again. They would circle once, twice, judging wind and current, then descend slowly, the hull slamming against the waves. The impact could break bones or tear the seams of the fuselage, but they rarely hesitated. The aircraft would taxi through the foam, engines spitting salt water, until the survivors came into view, sunburned, half-conscious, clutching at each other as the great wings loomed above them like shelter. Hands reached out. Rope lines were thrown. One by one, the lost were pulled aboard, collapsing on the metal floor, too weak even to speak. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stared, unable to believe they were alive. The crew offered water, blankets, a cigarette if one could be spared. And then, without ceremony, they turned back toward the horizon, the heavy aircraft lifting once more from the sea, water cascading off its belly as it climbed toward safety. Many of those rescues happened under fire. Japanese patrol boats would open up with machine guns, trying to sink both the rescuer and the rescued. Pilots learned to use clouds for cover, skimming through rain squalls or hiding behind islands. There were times when the Catalina took off so overloaded with survivors that it barely cleared the waves, engines straining, spray hammering the glass. More than once, crews jettisoned ammunition and gear just to keep everyone airborne. The stories spread quickly through the fleets. Downed pilots spoke of being certain the end had come, until they heard that familiar rumble from the sky. Some said the sound itself kept them alive, willing them to hold on a little longer. Entire squadrons owed their survival to the Catalinas that refused to give up the search. There were men who returned to duty only to paint small angel wings on the side of their own planes, a silent tribute to those who had brought them home. To the men in the water, the Catalina was not just a machine. It was a promise that someone was still looking for them, that they were not forgotten. And to the men who flew it, every rescue was a quiet rebellion against the cruelty of the sea. When night fell, the rescued slept on the cold metal floor, their breathing mingling with the steady drone of the engines. The crew said little. They didn't need to. The ocean below was still full of danger, but above it, for just a moment, there was peace, held aloft by the wings of the angels of the sea. By the final years of the war, the Catalina had become more than an aircraft. It was a living legend. To those who fought beneath the waves, it was terror. To those who sailed the ocean, it was protection. And to those who once drifted helplessly on the water, it was the sound of grace. Across the Pacific and Atlantic alike, the deep thrum of its engines carried a meaning that no words could fully hold. Every man who had seen it, heard it, or been saved by it carried that sound forever. German U-boat crews learned to fear it before they even saw it. The stories spread through the submarine pens of Lorient and Kiel, tales of comrades who surfaced at night, only to be greeted by a silent shadow that appeared without warning. Survivors whispered of the winged ghost, a shape that blotted out the stars before unleashing fire. Many captains began to dive at the first hint of propeller noise, knowing that if the Catalina had found them, the ocean itself might soon turn against them. What was once mocked as clumsy and slow had become a name spoken with respect, and even dread. Among Allied sailors, that same name carried warmth. They painted small silhouettes of the flying boat on ship bulkheads, tucked photographs of it into lockers, and raised mugs whenever one passed overhead. It had become their guardian, the long, watchful eye that never blinked. On nights when convoys moved through dangerous waters, crews would sometimes hear its engines in the distance, echoing over the waves, and they'd smile. It meant someone up there was watching, and for a few moments fear loosened its grip. For the men who flew her, the Catalina was not a tool. It was a companion. Pilots spoke of the aircraft as if it were alive, stubborn, loyal, occasionally temperamental, but always ready. They learned every sound it made, every vibration in the hull, every creak of the wings as it fought the wind. They trusted it more than luck, more than prayer. Some swore the plane had a soul, that it knew when they were in trouble and carried them home on sheer will. One pilot, after ditching his crippled Catalina in a storm, later said, "She floated long enough for us to live. That's all that mattered." Another crew, after rescuing 6 men from a sinking destroyer, scratched a single phrase into the metal beside the cockpit. "She waits for no one, but she never leaves her own." And then there were the rescued, men who woke to the roar of those engines after days adrift. Many never even saw the faces of their saviors clearly. They remembered only the shadow descending and the feeling of strong hands pulling them from the sea. Years later, veterans would still look up at the sound of a distant propeller, half expecting to see those wide wings again. The bond between man and machine outlasted the war itself. When the fighting ended, Catalinas carried mail, supplies, and explorers into corners of the world untouched by runways. Some became firefighting aircraft. Others were sold to private pilots who simply couldn't bear to see them scrapped. But in every role, they carried the same aura: calm, unshakable, patient. The flying boat that began as a joke had outlasted its critics, outflown its rivals, and outlived the very war that defined it. It had been called many names: the Duck, the Black Cat, the Angel. But in the hearts of those who knew it, it was something simpler and deeper. It was a reminder that courage doesn't always look graceful, and that sometimes the most unassuming things, a slow plane, a quiet crew, a heartbeat in the night, are what keep the world from falling apart. When the guns finally fell silent and the world began to stitch itself back together, the Catalinas did not fade away. While other aircraft were scrapped, stripped for parts, or left to rust in forgotten hangars, the flying boats simply kept flying. They were too stubborn, too practical, too perfectly suited for the world's wild and water-bound edges to be retired. Peace had no place for bombers or fighters, but there was always work for something that could go where nothing else could. They found new lives in distant skies. Some became firefighters, gliding low over forests, scooping up thousands of gallons of water in their bellies and releasing it over blazing infernos, the same wings that once carried war now bringing relief. Others turned explorer, charting unknown stretches of ocean, ferrying scientists, adventurers, and photographers into lands unreachable by roads or runways. There were Catalinas in the Arctic, their hulls frozen to the ice; Catalinas in the tropics, their engines echoing across jungled lagoons; Catalinas in the southern seas, carrying mail and medicine to islands that barely appeared on maps. Each one bore the marks of its history: bullet holes patched with rivets, faded nose art, instruments scratched by nervous hands. Yet they endured. Mechanics who had once been soldiers now tended to them like old friends. Pilots who had spent their youth in war returned to the cockpit with gray hair and calm eyes, still trusting those same engines to carry them safely home. In some corners of the world, people never knew the Catalina as a weapon at all. To them, it was a lifeline, the plane that brought food, doctors, or news of the outside world. Children on remote islands would run to the shore when they heard the distant thrum of its propellers, pointing at the sky and shouting. The sound that once meant danger had become a song of connection. But for the men who had known her in war, every takeoff carried a quiet echo of the past. The feel of the throttle, the vibration through the seat, the view of sunlight catching on the wing. It all carried memories of long nights, endless oceans, and comrades never forgotten. The Catalina had outlived empires, outlasted the conflict that birthed it, and proven that strength was never about speed or glamour, but endurance. Even today, a few still fly. Their engines are older, their frames weathered, but when they rise from the sea, the sight is unmistakable. That same graceful arc, that same patient climb into the clouds. Watching one lift from the water is like seeing a ghost from another age, something that refuses to vanish completely because the world still needs a reminder of what resilience looks like. The Catalina was never meant to be beautiful, yet beauty found it anyway, in its persistence, its quiet defiance, its ability to turn ridicule into reverence. It began as a plane nobody wanted and ended as a legend no one could forget. And as it disappears once more beyond the horizon, wings gleaming in the fading light, it leaves behind a lesson written across the sky and sea alike, that sometimes the simplest ideas, the ones mocked first and understood last, are the ones that change the course of history forever.